Right, sorry about this. Let me just get a bit more set up. You can see I'm very well prepared. The
Producing console button.
yeah.
Oh, dead on.
Yeah, it's better stop that. Yeah.
No?
Yeah, it's doing something.
No,
I think.
just letting you know.
Okay.
Yeah, I think we'll start a little bit behind schedule, but okay. So this talk is about the Drupal 8 plugin API. A little bit about me first. My name is Matt Smith. That's my Twitter and Drupal.org usernames. I've been actively working with Drupal 8 and Drupal 8 Contrib for probably about a year and a half now. So both really contributed patches to Drupal core, which is quite a laborious process, but also just taking contributed modules that are really well used in Drupal 7 and porting them to Drupal 8 so they're ready when Drupal 8 finally comes out. I work for CTI Digital. We're an agency in Manchester. We work on some fairly interesting, fairly large projects. So enough about me. So has anyone worked with object-oriented PHP before, or in any other languages? Well, a few of you. So this is probably really basic, but I guess just a few really basic, a few basic things on object-oriented. Really very basic. This is just so you can kind of understand the presentation a little bit better. There's a lot of stuff with object-oriented that I definitely recommend you go read about. There's plenty of resources on the internet, and I also suggest don't necessarily just look at PHP. There's a lot of resources about other languages as well, and a lot of the main concepts are transferable between languages. So don't get bogged down with just looking at PHP resources. There's definitely other resources about. So so in Drupal 7, you might have seen some object-oriented constructs. Drupal 7, to my knowledge, I can't think of many modules that really use object-oriented properly. But some of the constructs that PHP provides are used. So you've got properties of objects. So that's the node ID there. That's instantiating a new class, so a new object of the type standard class, and that is calling a method, which is just like a function on a class. So that's really the limit of where object-oriented and object-oriented constructs were used in Drupal 7 and earlier. But for Drupal 8, there's been a really massive change. The main reason for that change is not Symfony or anything like that. It's literally just because Drupal 8 now supports PHP 5.3. And in 5.3, it's actually, I think, depends on 5.4 now. But 5.3, there were many changes to PHP. And really, it made PHP a first-class object-oriented language. So that's the big change in Drupal 8. It's not the introduction of Symfony, although that has made a lot of changes. Really, it's sort of the introduction of the PHP 5.3 and the sort of new standards and ways of working that brings. So to work successfully with Drupal 8, you really need to understand object-oriented. So this is what we need to know for this presentation. I a really holy analogy. There's a lot of holes in it, but any good analogy has a lot of holes in it. So we've got a sort of hierarchy here of an animal, a mammal, and a dog. And we'll have a look at how we could write that in PHP. So you could have an animal interface, and that animal interface has a few methods on it: move, sense, eat, and respire. And so they're essentially functions. And what an interface does, it's essentially a contract which says any code using a class that is of this type, that is of animal interface, knows that these methods must be available. If those methods aren't available on that class, then there'll be a runtime error. So it can guarantee that these methods exist, and it can call these methods. And that means you can have multiple different classes that are used interchangeably. As long as they all implement this interface, they will be able to be used interchangeably. And I guess another thing to note is you can never have a class that is just an animal interface. You can never have something that is just an animal. It's something more specific than that. It's more sort of a way of grouping things. So this is an abstract class. And an abstract class is sort of like a mixture between an interface and a full class. So an abstract class can implement methods. It can actually just have just like the interface, where it literally just has the method with no body inside. So this is mammal base. You can't have just a mammal. You can't instantiate this, so you could not have an object of the type mammal base. You must have a class that extends this. And you'll see this a lot through Drupal 8. There's a lot of sort of base classes that give you boilerplate. And this is a good example of it. So finally we come down to the actual class, which is dog. So this is the class that you'd instantiate an object of the type dog. And dog extends mammal base, and it's kind of got move and sense, which it overrides from the abstract class, to be a bit more agile and to sniff really well. And so that's really all I'm going to say about sort of object-oriented. It's definitely something that you want to learn more about. All right. Okay, so what are plugins? Now, plugins in the Drupal sense are really swappable pieces of functionality. So you could have you could have some calling code that consistently interacts with something, and that thing can be interchangeable. And additional modules provide those things. And plugins that perform a similar type of functionality are plugin types. So generally, plugins consist of some method of identification. So there's some metadata that needs to be defined about the plugin, and also the location of that plugin. Where can that plugin be found? Then there's the creation. You need to be able to access that plugin, whether that's creating a new object, whether it's accessing a function, a sort of callback, and then obviously there's the plugin itself. So generally, this is what a plugin system consists of. Now in Drupal 7, there were some examples of plugins in inverted commas. These don't necessarily fit with what with the previous slide, because these are all real plugin systems. They're not all the right way of doing it, really. But CTools plugins, if you've ever used those, like layouts for panels, that's one example. CTools content types, feeds uses CTools plugins for integration there. So they're quite heavily used in Drupal 7, and really that's what the Drupal 8 plugin system was based on. And then you've got all your info hooks. And I'm not sure if they've totally gone yet, but there's very, very few info hooks left in Drupal 8. So hook block info is a really good example. That's been replaced by plugins now in Drupal 8. Hook block info, you had hook block info, you then had hook block view, hook block settings form, hook block submit. So you had a series of magically named hooks to provide blocks. So that's sort of it's not a plugin, but it's quite analogous with plugins. And then there was various custom solutions as well. So in Drupal 8, plugins are used for everything pretty much. Everything's an entity, and an entity is a plugin. So these are really just a few of the places that they're used in. So it's a really good API to understand and to know well. So let's look at how we actually implement a plugin. So how do we specify a block? So as I mentioned in Drupal 8, this would have been by hook block info. In Drupal 7, it would have been hook block info. In Drupal 8, you implement a plugin. So this is the code that provides a little powered by Drupal block that I believe in the standard profile it's in the footer by default. There's not much code there. So this is a class that has a single method on it. And you've probably noticed there's something a little bit weird going on with the comments. So these are called annotations. So you've got just the normal comment that describes what the class does. This is the identification part of plugin API. So this identifies some metadata about the plugin. It gives it an ID. It says it's a block because you could have different plugin types. Block is a plugin type. It says this plugin is of the type block, and it gives an admin label which is translated. So these are annotations, which are something that are relatively standard within modern PHP frameworks. And the other thing that you may have noticed is that we're extending block base. So this is block base is an abstract class. What is block base? So there's a simple answer and there's a more complicated answer. So that's the complicated answer. There's various interfaces, abstract classes that sort of build a tree of inheritance. Finally, we get down to system powered by block. Forget about that. The simple answer is that actually you don't need to worry about all that. Drupal gives you that boilerplate by default. You just need to make sure that you're extending from block base or whatever the correct base class is for that plugin type. And unless you really need to override something there, so you can override it, but generally you'll only need to implement a few methods and you'll just let block base and its descendants do whatever it needs to do. So that's implementing a really simple block. We can have a look at a little bit more of a complex example of implementing a block. So this is the book navigation block. So this is for the book module that's in Drupal core. And this provides a little navigation menu. So again, we've got our annotation. Notice there's an extra category property there. So that puts it into the menus category. Extending block base again. So here's the actual class. So previously, the example we saw before was just implementing build. This one actually provides a form. It handles the submission of that form, and it's got some default configuration. So hopefully you can see that if you've ever implemented a block and you've got these random functions that are sort of magically named, hopefully this looks a lot sort of neater and it's all sort of it's all grouped together in a single class. You've not just got stray functions sat around. Hopefully this looks a lot nicer and a much nicer way of doing things. So blocks and most plugins in Drupal use annotations on a class. But there are some alternatives to that, and I think this really shows the flexibility that the plugin API provides. So that's one way of using plugins. I'm going to show you another way that plugins are used in Drupal core, and that's using YAML discovery, and that's how local tasks are defined. So list and permissions, they are defined in a YAML file, and YAML is probably another thing that you're going to have to get used to in Drupal 8. So YAML is sort of a text format for defining configuration. So this is the user.localtasks.yaml, or a little snippet of it anyway. And this defines the view and edit tabs that you see on a user when you're viewing a user. So the user.view is the name. These should actually be indented. But user.view is the name, and we're saying on the root that's called user.view, show a tab with the title view, and the base root. So the root name is what that tab will link to, and the base root is where that's going to appear on. Edit, so that links to user.edit. It's got the title of edit, and the base root, so the group of tabs that it's on, is the user.view group. So that looks very different to the plugin that we saw before, where there was a class, there was code. This is just a YAML file. So how are those two things similar? Well, actually, there's a single class. So the difference is that our plugins had a class, and they had some metadata, and there was a one-to-one relationship there. In this case, there's one class, and there's multiple definitions of that metadata. So by default, the class that's used is the local task default, and based on the metadata, based on the configuration of that plugin, that class does different things. It shows different tabs, and with different titles and different links in different places. You can actually override that class. So within here, you can actually specify a different class to use. So my module provides the local task special class, and we can define that class, and this plugin instance will use that class, and we can have some different logic in there, whatever that may be. So that's the basics of the plugin API in, I guess, being a user of the plugin API. And we're going to look at some more complex stuff now. So initially, plugin derivatives. And plugin derivatives are quite a complex thing to wrap your head around. The best example, and the example I'm going to use, is if you imagine the menu block. So in Drupal 7, for each menu defined on the site, you have a block that you can place in a particular region. The class behind that, the actual logic behind that is exactly the same. It's just displaying a different menu each time. In Drupal 7, if you've ever had an info hook where you've had a for each loop, so you've looped through and provided different info for each item within an array, this is the alternatives. This is what the alternative is in Drupal 8. So the example of system menu blocks. So this is a class, but this class should provide multiple blocks. It's not a single block on the UI that you can place. This should provide multiple blocks, one for each menu. So the class stays the same, and this should all look very similar. So you've got your block annotation, which has an ID, an admin label, and a category. There's an additional key here where there's a derivative that's specified, and that derivative is another completely separate class, and the derivative provides, the job of that class is to provide the different. So this is your plugin definition, and the job of that class is to kind of provide sub-definitions of that definition, and we'll see that in the next slide. And again, the class is exactly the same. So this is the system menu block class, which is system menu block there. So that's the class that we pointed to there. And it extends another base class. So again, there's stuff in there that you don't need to worry about. You just need to implement this method, which is get derivative definitions. So this method takes the base plugin definition, which is this. So that gets that as an array. That's the base plugin definition. And the job is to return an array of derivatives. So to turn that single base plugin into an array of plugin definitions. And it does this by taking that base plugin definition, using that as a default, and it does a loop. So for each menu, it goes for each one, provides an admin label, and sets some caching. So really, it's just changing. The label. So it's changing the label from menu. It's changing that to the actual name of the menu. So that's what you'll see in the block admin UI. And the other important thing to notice is it's using the machine name of the menu there as the key. So this is returning an array that's keyed by the machine name of the menu, and it's changing a few items within the definition. Because that's really important when you come to actually use the derivative. So we've gone all the way back now to our system menu block class. And this class implements the build method. This is literally all that this class is. I've just taken a few comments out and nothing else. This kind of shows how little code you need to write because of all the boilerplate provided by block base. So the build method, it gets the derivative ID, and that derivative ID is this variable here, menu, the machine name of the menu. So that's the difference. That for each time this block is displayed, that's what's unique, and that's then used to build the menu tree, and that just returns a render array that can be rendered on the front end of the site. So that's derivatives. And next we're going to actually look into, I guess, the most advanced topic in how we actually, as module developers, can allow other people to extend our modules by defining plugin types. And I guess this is what I really want people to do in Contrib is to use the plugin API. The plugin API is a brilliant API, and hopefully this may get you guys to use it if you're building any Contrib modules. It's definitely the right way to provide sort of extensibility in your contributing modules. So these are the four elements of a plugin manager. So you've got your plugin manager, you've got the annotation class, so that defines the annotation and what you can specify within that annotation. I mean, it also specifies the name of the annotation. You've got the plugin manager itself and the plugin interface. So that's the contract that is drawn up to say any plugins of this type, you can call these methods on it with these arguments and expect to get something back. And then optionally, you can provide a plugin base class. So most plugins provide these base classes. We saw block base earlier. I don't know of any plugins that don't provide a base class, but it is optional. It doesn't need to be provided. So the annotation class. So this example that I'm showing you here is for text filters. So these are filter plugins. So we've got the class name filter, and it's got a few properties. So these are the properties that can be used within the annotation. So you've got ID, title, description, status, cache, settings, and these have some default values as well. So default values can be provided in here. And that's used like this. So filter relates directly to the name of the class there. So for every different plugin type that you use, that'll be different, and that says this plugin is of the type filter. And then we specified an ID, a title, and some settings for that plugin. We've got filter base, which we'll look at later. So that's the base class that the plugin is going to use. So the plugin manager. I guess this is a good time to explain what a service is. So a service is really a stateless class that is generally only used or only instantiated once and is reused throughout the system. Basically, all the sort of business logic should go into services, and services are defined in a services.yaml file. Because this allows you, it puts the services into configuration rather than into code. So they're not really hard coded, because these can be changed, they can be swapped in and out. So you can actually completely replace whole parts of Drupal 8 without hacking core. You can literally just remove swathes of it and replace it with your own code if you ever wanted to do that. And services allow you to do that. So we're going to define a service, which is the plugin manager and filter service here. So that's the name of the service, plugin.manager.filter, and that points to a class called filter plugin manager. And when you create that new class, when you construct that new class, it takes a couple of arguments, and these point to other services. So this allows you to have dependencies between services. If you didn't have the service container, which is what this is kind of part of, this is the configuration for the service container. If you didn't have that, you'd have to manually manage all your dependencies, which can get really quite difficult. Instead, we can just define it in a YAML file and say, this class should be constructed with these two services as dependencies. So this is the filter plugin manager class, and it actually just implements a single method, and this is the construct method. The two underscores here, they denote that it's a magic method. And construct is the method that is called when you instantiate a new object of the type filter plugin manager. These are the arguments that get passed, so you've got namespaces and something that goes off the screen, which map directly to these. And from these, it calls the parent constructor, so it calls the constructor for default plugin manager, and it provides three arguments to that constructor. And it provides plugin/filter. So namespaces, I guess, would be useful to talk about there. So namespaces, you may have noticed actually that some of these classes are named the same thing. The class name is exactly the same. And really, namespaces allow you to have interoperability between multiple projects. You could have two projects, two libraries within your code base, and they could be using classes with exactly the same name. So what namespaces allow you to do is make that more specific. And there's a few different ways of actually, there's a few different standards of using namespaces. Drupal 8 did use PSR 0, it now uses PSR 4. So that allows, PSR 4 is a standard way of naming classes and naming namespaces. And it's also a standard of where you put those classes within a file directory, which allows them to be auto-loaded. All we really need to know is that we're passing all the namespaces into the constructor, and we're saying plugin/filter. That's sort of like the subdirectory of the namespace, sort of the sub namespace that's going to be used, and that's where the plugins can be found. So within each, some modules have a source directory now, and within that source directory, inside plugin/filter, that's where the plugin manager will look for plugins of this type. And so as long as you put them in there with the correct annotation, they'll be found. And then this here, that points to our annotation class that we created in the previous slide. So that's that. So that's pointing to that class, so it knows what annotation class to use for that plugin type. Additionally, it's calling this alter info, and alter info allows you to have an alter hook. So hook filter info alter, which allows plugins of this type, the metadata around them to be altered in an info hook. So other modules can actually alter the definition of this plugin. And that's all there is to a plugin manager. Like, that's the central controlling class for this plugin type, and it's about 10 lines of code, because all the clever stuff happens in the default plugin manager. So this is the interface that defines what a filter plugin, what methods should be on that. So this allows the calling code to actually interact with filters in a consistent way, and to know that you can interact with it in this way. So there's various methods, and it provides the arguments for each of those methods as well. So that's the contract. You could just stop there. Generally, you want to provide a base class that does some sort of useful things, and sort of prevents whoever's using the plugin to have to write everything, because there's going to be some boilerplate there. So it can do things like provide defaults. So by default, default configuration returns just an empty array. It can implement. It can actually provide default functionality. So in this case, it's getting the description from the plugin definition. And it can also just provide empty methods. So although tips was defined in the interface, if you're extending filter base, you don't actually have to implement that. So there's just a sort of a null implementation of it, which may look a little bit weird. If it's not required, why would it be? Why would it be in the interface? Well, I guess really it's just a null implementation. It's just going to return null, no filter tips. So you don't have to implement that. Another example of that is actually used quite often in core is where you might have validated a form, and you'll have a method for building that form and validating that form. And often the validation will be just an empty implementation, so you don't have to worry about that if there's no validation. And you can just implement the actual building of the form and the submission of the form. So that's your filter base. And
the benefit of that, I guess, would be so validation if you do decide to do it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So so it knows what parameters to expect, and also the calling code knows that it's there, so it knows it can call it, even if it's probably going to just get null back. It knows it can call it. It knows it's going to be there to call it. So yeah, it kind of looks a little bit weird initially, but if you think about it, there are sort of benefits. There is sort of method behind the madness. Yeah, so that's really it to creating a plugin. So from there you can actually create a class that extends filter base, which therefore means it implements filter interface. So that that contract is there. We can put the annotation on it, and we can make sure it's in the correct. We can make sure it's in the correct namespace. So as long as it's in plugin/filter, and it's got the annotation on it, and it implements plugin interface, that's all we need to do to add an additional filter. So any modules can provide filters and integrate with our module. And that's all there is to it, really. We've got any questions? Come on, someone ask a question.
How much different is 8 to 7?
Massively different.
They're doing the plugins.
So, I guess you mean between CTools plugins and Drupal 8 plugins? Yeah, they're very different. I mean, there's definitely similarities in. I guess, do you know the slide where you've got identification, creation, and the plugin itself? From that sort of abstract sort of high level, they're the same. They both tick all those boxes, but the actual implementation is quite different. But I'd say out of anything in Drupal 7, CTools plugins are the closest to what we've currently got. And CTools plugins we used and influenced Drupal 8 plugins very heavily.
With hooks, sorry. I was going to say how relevant is this to Symfony? How similar is that?
So plugins aren't a Symfony thing; they're a Drupal thing. They're actually really well abstracted. So you could actually, not directly, but it's really not far off. You could actually take the plugin system out of Drupal and use it somewhere else, in a Symfony app or a Laravel app, anything. It's really actually very well abstracted. So the plugin API itself is a Drupal thing. It's not a Symfony thing, but it could be. You could integrate it into anything really.
I was just going to ask, hooks have gone completely from Drupal 8?
They've not gone completely. So certain types of hooks, specifically info hooks, have been replaced by plugins. Where possible, hooks have been hooks have been removed, not even deprecated. Hooks have been removed where possible as APIs have been written. So any new APIs that are written or any parts of Drupal core that have had pretty much a total rewrite no longer use hooks.
For example, the form API.
Yeah, exactly. So the form API hasn't necessarily been rebuilt, but the way you define a form is different now. So so you use a class of that implements a form interface, and a form interface has get form ID. So previously that would have been part of the function name, or it would have been the function name. You have a build form, so that would have been the contents of the function. You've got a validate and then submit method as well there. And previously they would have been the name of there would have been the form ID underscore validate as a function name, and submit as a function name as well. So sort of magically named functions. So yeah, that's something that has been replaced and is now using classes and interfaces and is object oriented. So there's still hooks in there. Right. There's still quite a lot of hooks in there. And I started writing a module. So another way that hooks have been replaced, and hopefully in Drupal 9 will be totally replaced with events. So in the Symfony world and in a lot of sort of modern PHP frameworks, events and sort of event dispatcher systems are used, and it's very very similar to hooks, but it's an object-oriented equivalent.
Yeah.
So yesterday I started writing a module. I'll probably never get around to finishing it, but it actually implements all the hooks and fires an event. So you can actually subscribe to that event and work in an object-oriented way. So you never have to implement hooks. You just subscribe to those events that this module fires. But there's actually, it made me realise how many hooks are still in Drupal core. There's a lot of hooks in there still.
So will events potentially make plugins redundant?
No, they kind of do different things. So events are really for more sort of state-based things where where there's a process and an event gets fired. Whereas plugins are more for sort of containing logic. Yeah, exactly. So they are different and they can work together. But yeah, they're kind of different things. Does anyone think does anyone have any contributed modules? Then, do you think plugins can be used in any of those?
No, and the one I've got is different. But it might listed my goals.
Yeah.
So the right way to be using plugins then are custom modules. If you're going to use, they have a suite of custom modules.
Yeah.
You'd still write plugins if you're going to use that functionality in other custom modules.
Yeah. So
application.
Yeah, I guess with your custom modules, you're going to be limited in how. You're probably not going to implement a plugin type in a custom module, because normally custom modules are fairly sort of encapsulated. They just sort of they do a single thing, and they don't need any integration with anything else. So generally, you're not going to implement a plugin type. But what I demonstrated from the blocks and the local tasks is that you're actually going to be using them all the time. You're going to be creating plugins of existing types all the time. You're going to be creating blocks. You're going to be creating local tasks. You're going to be creating entities. They're a plugin. Everything is a plugin. So most things are a plugin. So to create one of those, you're going to have to use the plugin API. Even if you're not creating your own plugin types, it's a really useful API to understand, so you can define your own plugin types.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, yeah.
I'm not a developer, but from your training, how long typically would you suggest it would take to learn, not to learn, but to kind of get up to speed with Drupal?
I guess it's a difficult one to put a figure on, really, but yeah, it's a difficult one. I guess it's I'd rather say what the best way of learning Drupal is, rather than saying it's going to take
X amount of hours.
Yeah, exactly. I'd rather say the best thing to do is to find a module that is maybe not that well maintained, or maybe the maintainer hasn't started porting it yet. Create an issue in the issue queue, start porting it. Even if it never actually gets used, it's a really good learning experience. Getting the Drupal issue queues, and the best way is to learn is to do, really. So that, I guess if you are that kind of learner, then get stuck in with porting contributing modules and actually getting in Drupal core. That's how I've learned all of this. I guess if you're more into kind of writing, reading articles and stuff like that, there's loads out there. Probably the best sort of central place to go to is there's sort of this week or this 2 weeks in Drupal core. So every week or two there's an article that's published, and it lists at the bottom. It sort of lists what changes have happened in Drupal core. It also lists articles that sort of instructional articles and things like that. So I'd definitely have a look at that if you're sort of into reading stuff rather than just getting in there and doing it. Any more questions? Cool. That's it then.